We are live. It is Webinar Wednesday here in the Lulu sphere, Lulu atmosphere. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I can see that a lot of folks are already saying hello to all of you. David said, great to be here. Great to have you, David, and everyone else. Let's find out where some of y'all are from. Indianapolis, Missouri. That's good. Oh, look. Jeff Goins, our presenter today, already active in the chat. He's just super stellar and hopping in there. So I don't want to waste anyone's time. We'll go ahead and get into it. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Chelsea with Lulu. I am Lulu's brand engagement manager. And we are here today to talk about how to write a bestseller with Jeff Goins. So just a little bit of background. I came across Jeff Goins on the internet a few years ago, and I just really appreciated that whenever I would see him speak about creating art or writing or kind of following what you're good at and your passions, tying that to creating a business out of it. And I think a lot of authors are really excited about writing and about the prospect of writing books, but the business piece of it is something that's sometimes a bit of an afterthought. So I love that Jeff was able to marry the two and really kind of keep those conversations in tandem. So I'm so excited to have him joining us today. So he's the best-selling author of 5 books and a writing teacher to over 20,000 students in the past 10 years. So he knows what it is to be a successful author. And so today he is going to take us through what your path will look like to creating a book that will become a bestseller. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand this right over to Jeff.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Hold your applause, please. Hold your applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you to Chelsea and to the Lulu kitten. So good to be here with you guys. Hi, Carla from Cortona, Italy. Wow. And another Carla from Jacksonville, Florida. So many Carlas. My name is Jeff Goins. I am the best-selling author. I've been writing my whole life, but I've been doing this professionally for the past 10 years. And as Chelsea mentioned, I basically write books, and then I teach writers and help them get their creative work out into the world through blogging courses and writing courses, in-person events, mastermind seminars. We've done all kinds of things over the years. And I do what I do because I believe that many creative people don't get the attention that their work deserves. I know what it's like to be an artist, to be a creative person, to put a lot of time, energy, and intention into the work that I do. And then just kind of like, wait, you know, what's going to happen? Whether it's writing a book or starting a business or launching a website, putting some piece of my work out into the world. I know the pain of creating something and waiting to see what happens. And the gap between making something and seeing the transformation that I believe it was intended for, in that gap is what we call marketing. And if you're like me, most of my life, I've had a really bad relationship with the word marketing until I became a marketing director of a nonprofit, which was a job that I did for 7 years. And through that job, I learned that marketing is just helping worthy ideas spread. Marketing is the art and science of helping worthy ideas spread. And my job was to raise funds and get volunteers interested in the work that we were doing as a nonprofit, where we were doing international relief and development work. And I remember swearing to myself in that job, because my job was to essentially take people's ideas and stories and make them more interesting, make them sticky, catchy, remarkable, whatever word you want to use. And I remember saying to myself, you know, the next job I have, the next business I'm a part of, the next organization I work for, I want to be in charge of the stuff that gets made, because if you're in charge of the stuff that gets made, it's easier to market it. It's easier to promote something that's cool and interesting versus something that's boring and kind of lame. And I took that intention without being super conscious of it, but you know, I was kind of aware of it. I took that intention and I became an author. And as I mentioned, I've been doing this work for 10 years now. And you would have think I would have started my job as a writer knowing how to market my own work, but I didn't. It took me several books to realize that we as authors, as writers, as creators of ideas, have to do more than just make something that we think is good and try to put it out into the world. And it took me several books to realize this and publish my first bestseller. And over the years, I've studied other best-selling authors and people who are successful at writing books and putting them out into the world. And I think I've cracked the code, or at least uncovered a bit of the mystery of what it takes to publish a bestseller, what it takes to get a lot of people to read your work. And this training is very simple. First of all, I'm not selling anything. I'm only giving stuff away for free. You'll have an opportunity to download something at the beginning and end of the seminar when I turn on my slides. If you choose to download that, you can join my email newsletter list, and I send out 1 to 3 emails a week, depending on if we're promoting something or if I'm just sharing a new piece of content that I'm creating. And that's it. That's all I'm selling. That's all I'm sharing. And then the rest is just a teaching to help you take either your next book idea or your current book that you're working on or have even launched, and learn how to talk about it in a way that's going to be interesting to people. So before we get into that, I just want to kind of get to know the room, if that's okay. Who here is an author? Like, you've already published a book. Just type me in the chat. You've already published a book. Type me in the chat. And if you haven't already published a book, type not me in the chat. So either you have a book out in the world, you've published it, you've done the hard work of writing and publishing a book, whether that's through Lulu or Amazon or whatever, or publisher, or you're still waiting, right? You're still working on a book, or you're you haven't even started. So if you have published a book, type me, and if you haven't, type not me. Oh, I was looking at the chat, but I was looking at it at the bottom. I was like, man, everybody's being really quiet, and I feel like I have to fill this time. Anyway, okay, I see. All right, lots of not me's. Senyukta said self-published a few. Okay, some me's too. Thomas, Sandra, Suzanne. Cool. All right, good to know. So, sounds like it's Cristelia. Oh, wow, interesting name. So I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. Is a ghostwriter. Very cool. Love that. Very interesting. David's in the final editing of his book. And Angelos is planning to publish his first book. Cool. So it sounds like it's mixed. So great. This is perfect. If you have written a book, if you're working on a book, or if you want to write a book someday, I want to talk to you about a piece of the puzzle that most authors overlook, which is the idea. And we're going to get into that, why this is actually the secret, the seed to all of your other success. So lots of people are going to teach you how to publish a book. That's great. Lots of people are going to teach you how to promote a book. That's great. I want to start at the very beginning, that before you can get an oak tree, you have to start with an acorn. And if you don't have an acorn, if you don't have the right kind of seed, it's not going to grow into what it needs to be. This took me many years of trying and failing before I realized the work that I was doing in the nonprofit world applied to my work as an author, which is to say that it's hard to promote something that's just good, because most of us aspire to write good books, and we fail. Right. And we fail because a good idea makes for a bad book. And what you need to learn is the art of being interesting, of helping your work spread. Have you ever written something or seen somebody do something similar to what you've done, and they've had a lot more success than you have, and it's just frustrated you? Give me a yes if that's you. Like, you've worked really, really hard. Some of you have published dozens of books, which is amazing, and you haven't necessarily seen the success that you think you deserve. Meanwhile, it's okay to admit that, by the way. Meanwhile, there's somebody over here who's doing what you're doing, and they're having phenomenal kinds of success, and they're making it look easy when it feels quite hard to you. Just if you're feeling that, if that resonates with you, just type yes in the chat. I'll give you a minute to do that. Cool. I'm seeing some yeses. Rose, Leslie, Darnie, Thomas, Abilene. That's how I have felt and feel. I'm like, what is this person doing that I'm not doing? And I remember talking to an author not so long ago who sold 20,000 copies of his book in the first week. And I was just in awe. Hit all the bestsellers list, New York Times, USA Today, etc. And I said, how did you do it? He said, well, I just wrote a good book. And I thought, oh, that's all you have to do, just write a good book? I had no idea. And I think a lot of times when we say good, we really mean interesting, and I want to unpack that. I'm going to give you 3 tools here today. Super simple stuff. I'm going to give you an opportunity to email me your next or current book idea. This teaching, this seminar that we're going to go through together, super simple, not the easiest thing to implement, but once you understand the simplicity of it, I think it'll make a lot of sense. And we're going to walk through why some books are bestsellers and others are not. So let's jump in. I'm going to share my slides. Let's make sure you guys can see all of that. I'm going to share this. Let's see what happens if I do this. Yeah, okay. All right, let's do this. Can you guys see this all right? Okay. Everybody see that? Let me know in the chat if you can see that. And Chelsea, if you want to chime in audibly and let me know if you can see that. It says, How to Write a Bestseller by Jeff Goins.
That is what I'm seeing.
Cool. All right. I'll go ahead and leave my camera on and I'll let you see my slides. And we've got a pretty short teaching here. I'm gonna walk you through this. And then if at any point you have questions or you want to interrupt me, Chelsea, you can speak up on behalf of the audience if somebody has a burning question. But I'm gonna move through this, and if I feel the need to check in with you guys, I will, and then we'll have a good chunk of time for questions at the end. Again, this is a very simple way of learning how to talk about the book that you've already published, or even better, how to write a book that is worthy of becoming a bestseller. We're going to define all these terms so you're not confused, because I know bestseller is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And I'm going to give you some very practical stuff and a way to let me know. And we can even kind of workshop this together. And if you have any questions, we can work on that together. And then you can email me if you have more questions. So super simple, low pressure, hopefully lots of fun. And we're going to focus primarily on your next book idea or your current book idea and how to help that get the attention it deserves. So before I jump in, let me know in the chat, are you with me? Just say, I'm with you. Like, are you tracking with this? Because I do want to ask you to just give me like the next 30 minutes of concentration, try to close out any windows. I want you to get the most out of this, so shut down any tabs, turn off your email. I'm going to put my phone down, put it on do not disturb. If you're willing to commit to that, and you don't have to, but if you're willing to commit to that, just type in the chat, I'm with you, and I'll give you a moment to do that.
And hey, Jeff, while everyone is getting with you, I just wanted to mention to everybody, if you have to drop out or you join late, the recording will be sent to everyone who registered, so you won't miss any of the goodness. Yep.
And for those of you who are able to make it to the end, stick around, because we'll workshop your book idea if you'd like. And this is something that I do. I teach online courses for writers, and I work one-on-one with authors as both a ghostwriter and writing coach. And so I love doing this. I love helping writers succeed. And if you have a burning question or a struggle, feel free to drop it in the chat. We'll try to spend some time at the end of the teaching to walk through that. All right, let's go. All right, first of all, thank you for your attention. So good to be here. Thank you to Chelsea and Lulu for having me. I just have a free gift for you. And I suppose all gifts ought to be free, otherwise they wouldn't be gifts. But if you go to goinswriter.com/20, and Chelsea, if you wouldn't mind just dropping that link in the chat so people can click that, Goinswriter, Goins, writer.com/20. There's a free book. It's just a short downloadable PDF based on an article that I wrote years ago that I turned into a longer form ebook. And it's just 20 tips for how to write a book. And this is from my past 10 years of experience of working with writers and publishing my own books myself, both traditionally and independently. So feel free to get that and work through that later. As I mentioned, I have published my own books. I'm an author, and I, over the years, have published many books under my name and under other people's names as both a ghostwriter and as an author. And I write typically in the nonfiction space. I've written memoirs, business books, and self-help and personal development books. And for years, I thought I just needed to write the best book possible. And what I learned is that that's not enough, that you can't just be good, you also have to be interesting. And when I began to unlock that, I was able to publish my own best-selling books and also help other people, other authors realize their dream of publishing a book that reached lots and lots of people by starting with the idea, by starting with the nugget, the seed of what it takes to kind of grow into a phenomenon. And so I want to explore some proven principles that I've learned over the years and why I think this works more often than it doesn't. So before we get into that, what is a bestseller? Because you've heard this term thrown around. Like, is this a book that sells a handful of copies within an hour and messes with the Amazon algorithms and is a #1 bestseller in a super niche category? Is that what we're talking about? No. Are we talking about publishing a book and buying 10,000 copies of your own book and then gamifying the system and hitting the New York Times bestseller list? No. Are we talking about somebody who simply calls themselves a best-selling author with no authority or credentials to back it up? No, that's not what we're talking about here. Many of you are savvy enough to know that there's lots of ways to cheat your way into this title of being a best-selling author. And that's not what we're talking about here, because that's not the point. If you buy 10,000 copies of your book, who cares if you can call yourself a best-selling author? Where did those copies go? How did they impact people? The point of writing a book is to reach the people that it was intended for. And so the way I define bestseller, because there's lots of ways to use this term that are confusing and not very helpful, is quite simple. I just looked it up in the dictionary. And this is my definition, but it's pretty similar to what you'll find in the dictionary, which is a bestseller often refers to a book or a product that stands out from others of its kind and redefines the genre. It is actually a book that sells better than most of its kind. So when I say bestseller, I'm not just talking about a special book. I'm not just talking about an interesting book. I'm not just talking about a book that hit a list once and never saw the light of day again. I'm talking about a book that sells better than most. Bestseller. That's what we're talking about. Can you guarantee that every book you write is going to be a bestseller? No, but it's more than just magic and luck that make these things happen. And that's what that's what I've learned. That's what I want to explore here together in this teaching. So a bestseller is a book that you've written that stands out and sells better than most of its kind and redefines the genre. So for example, have you ever heard the term lifestyle design? Say yes in the chat if you've heard this term before. The word Gatsby. Yeah, just say yes if you've heard this word before. Or the phrase love language. Just say yes in the chat. Some, if not all of these terms should be familiar to a lot of us, whether or not you've read the books that they are associated with. When we talk about being a bestseller, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about books that make a splash, that change the way people think about your specific space, whether that's young adult novels, whether that's relationship books, whether that's a certain kind of business book or productivity book. This is what you need to do in order to make that kind of splash. You've got to be willing to stand out. And the way that we do this is it requires a little bit of sophistication, which is what we're going to talk about here. So lifestyle design. That was a term coined by Tim Ferriss in the 4-Hour Workweek. That book sold 2.1 million copies, was translated into 40 different languages, and became an instant New York Times bestseller. Gatsby, 25 million copies sold, 42 foreign translations, and it continues to sell 50,000 copies per year, which is crazy because it never sold more than 20,000 copies in the author's lifetime. This was a book that became a bestseller long after F. Scott Fitzgerald, the author, died. And then finally, the 5 love languages. Whether you've read this book or not, you've probably heard the term love language. This book has sold over 12 million copies, was translated into 50 different languages, and became a New York Times bestseller 10 years. It's been a bestseller for 10 years, but it became a bestseller 7 or 8 years after it was published. The first year it only sold a handful of copies, and then it doubled its sales and then tripled, and it just kind of slowly became this phenomenal bestseller. So you've got 3 different books that we're gonna explore together and see how that translates to a book that you've written or that you're currently writing. And I love this quote by Victor Hugo: "Nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come." And so how do we follow in the footsteps of these books? How do we create our own bestseller that stands out from books of its kind and in some way add something new to the genre? We have to start with the idea, an idea whose time has come. And so what actually makes a bestseller? I mentioned there's going to be 3 takeaways from our training here today, 3 little exercises that will help you. First of all, if you've written a book, it'll help you think differently about how you talk about your book and represent it in the world, because how you as the author talk about the book is how other people are going to talk about the book and how that book is going to spread. Word of mouth is still the most effective marketing strategy for a book. And it's also the hardest to figure out. It's the hardest nut to crack. And here I want to argue that it all begins with the book, that the more marketing, the more remarkability that you bake into the book itself, the easier you're making it, the more you're going to help it spread on its own. So here's some fun reviews of these books that I mentioned. Megan Day wrote of The 4-Hour Workweek that it offers a solution consisting of a litany of shortcuts and misguided, destructive ones at that. Not too favorable of a review. Ruth SNYDE wrote this of The Great Gatsby. "We are quite convinced after reading The Great Gatsby that Mr. Fitzgerald is not one of the great American writers of today." That book was considered a flop and a failure, and the author himself died young. He was in his 40s. He died of a heart attack, and he died thinking of himself as a failure. He actually went into bookstores and would request copies of The Great Gatsby. He thought it was his best work, and he was reduced to buying copies of his own book just to try to keep them in bookstores. And Slate Magazine said of The 5 Love Languages, "As is true for most successful self-help books, the essential wisdom at the core of the 5 love languages at first seems laughably intuitive." So what is the point in sharing all these? Not everybody liked these books. They stood for something. They stood out. And in order to stand out, you have to pick a fight. In order to sell, you have to stand out. In order to stand out, you have to run the risk of being rejected. And what I learned through this process was I would write my best book and try to market the heck out of it and hope for the best. And then I would repeat the process, like waiting to strike gold. And it never worked. And the reason that it never worked is because I was trying to launch a bestseller. And before you launch a bestseller, you have to learn how to write one. I'm not talking about writing a book. I'm talking about writing the best book you can, writing a book that people already want to talk about, because there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And you are not in charge of the time, but you are in charge of the idea. And so what it takes is an understanding of what people are already talking about, what are the ideas and stories that are already being promoted, whether you write nonfiction, fiction, memoir, self-help, you name it, and then finding ways to stand out. And so that's what we're going to talk about here. 3 simple steps. And the first is that you need to start with category. So what is the category of your book? Whenever I talk to people, I mention I'm a teacher and coach of authors, writers, and creatives. And I've just worked with a lot of people over the years. Something like 20,000 people have gone through a variety of programs that I've done, from online courses to one-on-one coaching to group seminars and everything in between. And whenever I meet somebody who wants to write a book, they often tell me, "Jeff, I've got this great idea for a book." And I go, "Great, what's it like?" And they go, "Oh, no, it's unlike anything else out there. Like this is a completely unique book." And whenever I hear that, that's a red flag to me, because it tells me 2 things. One, they haven't done their homework. that, that they're not aware of the fact that there are lots and lots of books, that hundreds of thousands of books get published every year. And to think that your idea is completely original is a little juvenile. It's a little misguided. And so you've got to know the market that you're swimming in, you know, the space that you want to stand out in. And it's possible that they're right, that no book has ever been written about that. The second reason that this is a red flag is if that's true, there's probably a reason for that. If nobody's written a book about this, then it means that right now there's probably not an interest in it. And so what we want to do is, yes, you're special, you're unique, you have a unique message or story to tell, but you're not as special as you think. And what it takes to stand out is to, first of all, figure out what it means to fit in. So in order to stand out, you've got to know how to fit in. And I don't want to fit in. You probably don't want to fit in. But we have to first understand what's going on. Like, what are we standing out from? Otherwise, we're just kind of flailing around. And so we begin with the category. And so there's a few questions to ask. What kind of book is it? What other books are out there that that are like this? And so we talk about category, not just talking about fiction or nonfiction. We're talking about spy novels or detective stories. We're talking about coming of age, young adult memoir. Like, you want to get as specific as possible. And if you need help understanding the category, you just go to Amazon and search. I mean, this is where a lot of us order books. Some of us publish our books there. Obviously, we've got great solutions like Lulu. But if you just want to go buy a book, go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble online and just search a category, search a topic. And what you'll see is, find your favorite book, for example. You'll see there's categories, right? There are types of books that this book is like. You can do this on lulu.com too, right? You can see that it's not just the book, title, author, description, that there's a category, there's a genre, there's a space that this book fits into. So you want to know what that is. What kind of book is it? And then, who has said this before? I actually want you to make a list of at least 5 books that are like the book that you are writing, want to write, or have written. You need to understand what's out there, and then who has already said what you want to say, so that you can say it differently. And then finally, you want to understand the rules of the genre. Like, what are the conventions? What are people doing in this space, right? If you're writing a coming of age memoir, there are certain tropes, certain things that work in this space. And as Picasso said, you've got to learn the rules before you break them. So we want to understand what the rules are before we start messing with it. So, for example, you've got the 5 love languages. This was a relationship book that was published in the early 90s. And so, coming from that space, you've got a relationship book, right? So that's the type of book it is. What are some of the conventions? It's got lots of anecdotes. It was written by a pastor who had done a lot of marriage counseling and knew a lot of counselors and pastors and people who were meeting with couples. And basically just said, I think there's, he heard another person use the term love language. He said, I think there's 5 of those. And he affirmed the reader's bias, right? Which is that I want a love that lasts, right? That I'm unique, but also understandable. And so you've got this relationship book, lots of stories. There's an affirmation of the reader's bias. Like, these are the things that worked at the time that this book was published. But it stood out, from for example, from Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and that he said this is a little bit more complex than we thought. It's not just men and women, but there are these different ways that people relate to each other and want to give and receive love. And so once you understand the rules, you can learn how to break them and then stand out. And the phrase for this in the branding and marketing world is same but different. And I actually believe that you want to be about 20% different, 80% the same. To blow people's minds and surprise them and challenge their assumptions, you don't need to be radically different. You just need to be about 20% different. Think of the best-selling product of all time, the iPhone, was nothing new, but it was a combination of a bunch of different technologies in one beautiful, easy-to-use format. And we'd never seen it like that before, right? We'd never seen a touch screen internet device, phone, camera, all in one that could also play music. We had, bits and pieces of those things cobbled together, but nothing like this. So 80% of what the iPhone was, we'd already seen before, but the 20% that blew our minds was pretty amazing. It was very, very different. So an example of this is when there were some Disney executives in the early 90s. This was the renaissance of Disney. Disney had kind of died in the 70s and 80s due to some poor leadership and poor creative. This was when John Lasseter left Disney and became a part of starting Pixar. So they were not telling good stories. And in the early 90s, Disney started to do a comeback. They started to have a comeback. Aladdin had just come out, Beauty and the Beast. They were creating these really great stories and really amazing, beautiful movies. And they're sitting around and they're trying to greenlight this new movie called The Lion King. And they're very squeamish, some of the executives in this meeting, because they want another hit. And so far, the People movies have worked. The last time they tried animals in a movie was, Fox and the Hound, and it didn't go that well. And so they're going, no, we don't want to go back to this. We want to stay with People. And somebody interrupted this. I mean, it was not going in the right direction. Somebody interrupted the meeting and said, guys, don't you understand what this is? This is Hamlet, but with lions. And all of a sudden, everybody got it. Oh, Hamlet, but with lions. Same, but different. If you know the story of Lion King and you know the story of Hamlet, it's very similar. You've got a king who's assassinated, his brother is culpable, then you've got the son who is sort of exiled and he comes back. There's a meeting with the father's ghost. I mean, it's Hamlet almost to a T, but you've got lions. And this happens all the time in the world of storytelling, movies, novels, etc. We're always borrowing somebody else's story and then finding ways to make it new again. Same, but different. Hamlet was a 500-year-old story, and they just added lions to it. And all of a sudden, you had another bestseller. This was a movie. And so when we talk about the first piece of this puzzle, we're talking about the category. How can you stand out from your category? And so when you're promoting a book, when you're even thinking about it, you've got to have kind of these two pieces. One, my book is like X. It is like The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. It is like Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Work Week or F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, right? And you find a book that this is like, that you want it to be like. So you find some bestsellers in your category that have said something that you want to say, but you're going to say it different, right? And then you find a way to make it different. So my book is like X, but it's different like Y. And we can kind of work through that if you want. My book is like every other business book out there, but I'm going to write it as if it were a novel. This is the secret to Patrick Lencioni's success, is he's writing business books about very simple leadership and business principles, but he's writing them as novels. And when he started doing this decades ago, it was very unique and a novel approach to saying something. So you can change the format or you can change the argument. Remember, 80% same, 20% different. That's step one. My book is like X, but different like Y. The second step is, once you understand what the category is and how you're going to kind of buck the system a little bit, you've got to pick a fight. You've got to subvert the status quo. So once you understand the rules, you want to intentionally break them. And so part one is really about understanding who has said this before, how is my book going to be like what else is out there, and then how is it going to start to stand out. And then we want to get into the actual message of the book. And in the 70s, there was this sociologist named Murray S. Davis. And Murray Davis said this. He was a sociologist who was fascinated with phenomenology, with how ideas spread, with how things become phenomena. And what does that even look like? What are phenomena, and how do we distinguish really big ideas from smaller ideas? How do you get a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King Jr.? How do you get a movement or an idea to spread? How do you get a leader elected? How do you publish a best-selling book? What does this look like? And he argues that it's all at the core of the idea. And he said, we don't follow leaders because their ideas are good. We follow them because their ideas are interesting. Now you could apply this to authors. We don't buy authors' books because their ideas are good, because their stories are good. We buy them because they're interesting. And Murray Davis goes on to say that interesting is anytime you attack what your audience takes for granted. Anytime you attack what your audience takes for granted. That's why we started with category. What is it like? How is it different? And then how can you do some things that are radically different, that we've never seen before like this? This is how you begin to stand out with your message. And there's 3 ways to do this. There's 3 simple ways to stand out. The first is to take what people have typically understood as good and say it's bad. Take what people have typically understood as good and say, no. That's wrong. That's bad. Malcolm Gladwell does some version of this in every single one of his books. What you thought was this way is actually that way. But he does this quite brilliantly in a book called David and Goliath, where he says that strength is actually weakness and weakness is actually strength. That's an example of a big idea. The second way to do this is to say what's small is actually big, or you could do, the reverse. What's big is actually small. And an example of this, another Gladwell book, is The Tipping Point. Little things lead to big change. We typically think big things lead to big change, but no. It's the small things that lead to big change. And a third way to do this is to say what looks like chaos is actually order, or what looks like order is actually chaos. Things are not the way that they seem. My favorite kind of movie is a heist movie, Ocean's 11, that sort of thing. And this is the backbone of every heist story, every detective story. What looks like chaos, right? I don't know if you remember these like 5-minute mystery stories. I used to read them in school. And mystery is basically the order behind the chaos, right? And so what looks like, how's George Clooney going to get out of it this time? And it looks like a bunch of failure. And at the end of the story, you realize, this was the plan all along. That's chaos is order, or order is chaos. Anytime we see this, read it, hear it, connect with it, it's interesting because it's unexpected. It's a surprise. And this is how you begin to stand out. This is how you get people to talk about you, is you set the table, you understand the conventions, you understand the category that you're in, you follow the rules, and then you do something different, and that catches people's attention. All that to say, I don't want you to write a bad book. I'm not saying that being a good writer, telling a good story is not important. It's essential. It's just not enough, right? It's necessary, but not sufficient. And we all know, I think, that what causes you to stand out is not just being better than everybody, but being different, doing something unexpected. We love talking about novelty. We love sharing new ideas with people in a way that we understand them. So it's better to be different than it is to be better. So how did the 4-hour work week do this? Tim Ferriss did this quite brilliantly. He took a convention. Most people work 40 hours a week. They wait for retirement and think that it's expensive to live well, to live like the rich do. So you can look at this, and in the actual on the actual cover of the book, the 4-hour work week. First of all, the title itself is kind of offensive, right? I remember hearing about this book going, oh, that guy's full of it. That's a scam. No way, no way you can work 1/10 of the minimum amount of time that I thought you needed to be a responsible person. But then you look at the subtitle, Escape the 9-to-5. Again, a convention that he's defying. Live anywhere and join the new rich. So what are the rules that he's picking a fight with? You don't have to work 40 hours a week. You have to work 4. You don't have to wait to retirement. You could take mini retirements now. This is a message in the book. And you could actually, you don't have to be rich to live like a rich person. This is the message of the 4-hour work week. You don't have to wait for the good life. And that book went on to sell millions of copies, as I mentioned earlier. Why? Because he takes something that you assume is true and he says it's not true. Now, understand that you don't have to be right? That many of the ways that you can stand out is by simply picking a fight. Now, it would be good for it to be true, because if you're lying, people are going to find out pretty quickly. But as long as you challenge something that we have typically taken for granted, it is immediately interesting. And then if you can back up that claim, as Tim Ferriss does in a 400+ page book, you win. And so once you figure out how you want to stand out with the message or story that you're going to tell. Again, this could be like Hamlet, but with lions, or you're attacking the convention of the 40-hour work week in a career book. You want to be able to say it in a sentence. Everybody thinks X, but what's actually true is Y. Everybody thinks you need to work 40 hours a week. You only need to work 4. And this works for fiction, nonfiction, memoir, personal development, self-help, etc. And if you guys want to work through that, you can kind of drop your ideas in the chat. I want to give this to you, write this down. Everybody thinks X, but what's actually true is Y. And then we can workshop this a little bit at the end. Okay. We're 2 steps in. The third one is steal the structure. All right. First, we're going to start with category. Then we're going to subvert the status quo. We're going to get a message that allows us to stand out. And then finally, we're going to borrow the structure of a book that's already been successful, right? And so you don't need to figure out how to write a book. If you know how to read a book, you know how to write a book. You may not know that you know, but you do, because you've consumed lots of books. And a book is a very old technology. It's a 500+ year old technology. We've basically, with a few innovations in the past 30 years, we've basically been publishing books the same way for a long time. And the technology hasn't changed. You've got words on a page bound by, pieces of board and paper, right? And that's what you've always had. We have digital versions of it, we have audio versions of it, but at the end of the day, a book is words that we put together that connect with people. And so if you know how to read a book, you know how to write a book, and you've just got to be able to see the design, see kind of the order in the chaos of how to structure a book. So as I mentioned before, when you're doing your category research, ideally you want to have like 5-ish books that have sold really well in the space that you want to write in. And then you want to read those books and understand, how do they structure those books? How do they tell this kind of story? How do they set up their argument? What does it look like to write a memoir or a self-help book or a big idea, narrative nonfiction book that's going to change the way we think about World War II? Right? What does that look like? Well, you've got to read the book, read these books that are leaders in the genre, and then understand the structure and then replicate it in some ways. Again, 80% same, 20% different. You do want to stand out, but you want to start with some basic structure. To save you some time, I do think you should read some of the books in your space, but to save you some time, there are essentially 2 main formats for a book. Now, of course, there's lots of different ways to write a book. I don't want to oversimplify things, but I think this is a helpful model. There are 2 main categories of a book format, and this goes for fiction, nonfiction, memoir, you name it. And the first is what's called an arc. An example of this would be The Great Gatsby. An arc book builds gradually, uses suspense to hook the reader and get them to the end. And then there's a big payoff. There's a surprise ending. And I like what Sean Coyne says about this, that the ending of an arc, of a story narrative kind of format of a book, is that it is both surprising and inevitable. It feels like a novel, like a story. The second kind of format is what's called a modular book. Now, this is a book that is sort of built in pieces, and each chapter reads almost as if it were an article. When Tim Ferriss was writing The 4-Hour Workweek, this is what he said. And in fact, a writing professor from college told him, you should write each chapter of a book as if it were an article, as if that is the only thing the reader is going to read. And this is what's called a modular book. You could read chapter 3 without reading chapter 2 and get most of the meaning out of it. Whereas if you jump halfway into a detective story, it's not going to work that way. And so this is a modular book. You start typically by introducing the big idea at the very beginning of the book, what you're going to say. Then you offer lots of illustrations throughout the book, reinforcing the big idea. And each chapter feels like an article. You could read it by itself and it would make a lot of sense. You wouldn't be confused. That's a modular book. It's built, it's got modules. And so those are the 2 different types of books. So now how do we put all of that together? First, category. My book is like X, but different like Y, right? So understand what the book is like and then how it's going to be different. The Hunger Games is an example of this, right? It's like The Running Man by Stephen King, but it's with teenagers. Or it's like the Roman gladiators, right? It's basically that. It's Roman gladiator times, but in the future with kids on television. So my book is like X, but it's different like Y. Know your category, know kind of your category statement. Then figure out your big idea. Everybody thinks X, but what's actually true is Y, right? So you've got category. Here's what it's, same but different, similar to a lot of books in its space, but different in some key ways. Big idea is everybody thinks X, but what's actually true is Y. How are you going to attack the status quo? Challenge the assumptions of what most people are saying or how most people are telling stories in your space right now. And then finally, you want to pick a format, modular or arc. Pick a format to follow, but then find some ways to make it your own. Again, like finding a book that your book is like and going, okay, I'm gonna copy this. Nobody's gonna know that I'm gonna copy this. I'm gonna copy the format, but then I'm going to make it my own. And again, think of this as like a frame. So I'm not saying that you're going to plagiarize, but you're going to borrow. You're going to stand on the shoulders of the giants who've come before you and innovate based on what other people have already done. That's just smart. And so when we put those three things together, we have a big idea book. We have the making of a bestseller. Now, we could talk about how to launch a book and how to do this and how to do that, but we have to start with the big idea. And so that's what I wanted to share here today because I think it's really important. As I mentioned before, you can get a free download from me at goinswriter.com/20. More on the technicalities of writing a book. And if you'd like to share your book idea with me, you can shoot me an email at jeff@goinswriter.com, especially for those watching the replay. But for those of us who are live here, I'd love to jump in and answer any questions that you have about this process, how it would work for you. I'd love for you to try to challenge me and go, yeah, Jeff, what about this or what about that? Because I want to make sure this is helpful and makes sense to you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my screen. And yeah, answer any questions. Looks like we've got not quite 15 minutes. So yeah, I'm feeling self-conscious talking to 100 plus people, but not getting the feedback. So did that make sense? Go ahead and let me know in the chat what you connected with, what questions you have, what made sense, what didn't make sense. I'm going to read a couple of comments. Nick said this is very interesting. It's got me thinking. Some people have some questions about Lulu. I'll leave those to Chelsea.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, I'm gonna hop in. I put a little offer. I'm gonna go ahead and start it again to get Jeff's book. So if you see that, if it's popping up, this is the blue button that says get Jeff's book. I felt like that was compelling copy. So just a note here, if you click on that link right now, it will put you in another room. You'll leave this one. So we'll work on that in the future, but that link will work. Just right click, open it up in another window, and you'll be good to go.
Yes. Yeah. And if you guys have any questions about that, let me know. I'm at Jeff Goins on social media, and I give you my email address as well. But yeah, let's get into it. I'll answer any questions that you have. You can just go ahead and drop those in the chat. And I'll answer as many of those questions as I can. If you did ask a question earlier, instead of me having to scroll back, just go ahead and ask it again.
I actually grabbed a couple while people are kind of getting their questions in. Some from earlier. Robert had asked, and I know that you kind of touched on this, but does this apply to fiction, nonfiction, or either? So I know that you had mentioned that it does, but I don't know if you have any kind of tips or pointers, Jeff, that are really applicable to one or the other.
Totally. So if you're writing a novel, you may mess with the story structure. That may be your same but different. Or you may borrow an old kind of story, but you're going to put it in a new context. I mean, this is a very common way to make something feel new, but also be familiar, right? Like familiar but new at the same time. So as I mentioned, Hunger Games does this. The Great Gatsby did this in that it was codifying a time in history, the 1920s kind of flapper generation era, and but it was different in that it spoke to the optimism of that time, and the book doesn't end well. It's sort of depressing. It is in a way a book about greed and the American dream, and why the things that we aspire to get we don't always get. That was very different. You know, I mean, you have to understand that in the early, well, this came in the mid 1920s. People were really hopeful, really excited, but also a little bit jaded. And so, again, I think when you're writing a novel, same but different still applies. What do people assume is true for this kind of book? What have people already done? And then how can you stand out? Either pick an old story and put it in a new context, Hamlet, but with lions, or challenge the way people think about, what is sort of expected or normal in your genre. But yes, it works with both fiction and nonfiction. I think nonfiction is a little bit easier to understand. There's often a clear argument that you're challenging. I mean, we could go through the New York Times bestseller list from the past week and talk about how every single one of them is basically challenging an assumption in their particular space.
All right, let's see. Thank you for that answer. And then another one from Robert, actually, that he put in a little bit later is self-publishing, Lulu versus searching for a publisher. Well, this is, what he's asking what the pros and cons are. And, I know that they are numerable, so. Oh,
you're asking me pros and cons?
I'm happy to talk about why, self-publishing is great, but I think, your perspective would be very valuable.
Yeah, totally. So like the difference between self-publishing and traditional publishing, pros and cons, that's the question.
Yep.
Yeah. So I've done both. My first book was a self-published book that I published on Amazon almost 9 years ago, I think. And to my surprise, that book became a bestseller over the course of a decade. It wasn't immediately a huge success, but it became that way. And so I did that, and then I also have published traditionally, and I work with authors now, and I've helped them independently publish and work with traditional publishers, just depending on the project. So there is no right answer to this. I know for a lot of authors, it's important to get a book deal. And if that's important to you, go for it. Don't tell yourself you don't want something that you actually want. Try it. But understand that trying that is a process of typically building an audience, getting an agent, writing a book proposal, trying to sell it to a publisher. And that may take a year or two. One of the things that I do is I work with authors and help them write book proposals that help them sell those books to publishers. And we just sold a book 15 months after writing the proposal, we just sold a book 15 months after meeting the client and working with them and helping them write this proposal and sell it to a publisher. Now, last year was crazy, but the bottom line was they needed to build a bigger audience, and they just got a 6-figure book contract as a result of their patience, but it took 15 months. And if you feel like you have a message that you want to get out there now, the tools available to you are incredible. Lulu, I think, makes it really easy to put your work out into the world. I'm actually pretty unbiased about it. I do think that the self-publishing and independent publishing tools available to us are making are putting the onus on traditional publishers for why they should exist. But there are some good publishers out there, and I've had some good experiences with publishers and some not so good experiences. But my bottom line is, if they're willing to pay you what feels like a lot of money to you, and that's worth giving up some of the creative control and all of that, then I say go for it. But for a lot of people, it's not really a consideration because they don't have a big audience. They don't have a publishers knocking on their door. And I do think the best step for many new authors is to write a book, self-publish it, sell a bunch of copies of it, and then see if a publisher is interested in it. Because writing a book and self-publishing it doesn't preclude you from working with a publisher at some point if that's what you want to do. I worked with an author years ago who self-published a book and just followed this process, was very diligent in trying to get a bunch of people to buy the book all at once. He sold 1,000 copies of the book in its first day. And within a couple weeks of publishing this book, self-publishing this book, he got an offer from a publisher for a $50,000 book contract, one of the big 5 publishers. There are 5 big publishers in New York City, and this was one of them. And so he took this book that he'd self-published, and then he got paid $50,000 to publish it with a publisher. So yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer more nuanced questions, but I'm not for or against. But if you're going to work with a publisher, understand it's a long process. And if you don't have an audience of at least 5 to 10,000 people on your email list, understand that that's going to be an uphill battle, and you're probably better off independently publishing something right now. And then there's all the economics of it, and Chelsea could certainly speak to that. But yeah, that's my answer to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I appreciate you taking the time. All right, so I'm going to move on down the list. Rebecca says, great presentation. Fiction plotting. How often do writers rewrite plot while writing their book?
Oh gosh, I don't know. How often do they? I suppose it depends on the author. I'm not an expert on writing fiction. I've dabbled at it myself. I don't know. I mean, that's a great question. I teach that every book needs at least 5 drafts, and my understanding of plotting your book is a bit challenging. You know, like I think you want to get as much of that plotted out ahead of time, because once you get into the story, if you change it significantly, that's going to break something. But that's my best answer to that, because I don't typically write fiction. I certainly don't teach it. So I'm going to have to pass on answering that at the risk of sounding ignorant. I don't want to pretend to know something I don't know about.
I think that's very admirable. So, in that vein, sort of, this one's a bit more general, but Brandon is wondering, when do you decide when writing to scrap a story and put it in the graveyard?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to just kind of expand that to when do you give up on a project that you're working on versus when do you double down on it. Last year, I was working on I wanted to work on a book. I started working on a book pre-2020, and I kept trying to push it forward, and the amount of effort required just to keep me excited about the book was greater than the effort to write it. Like I had to psych myself up. Initially, it was something that I was excited about, but over time, my interest in it just waned. And so, how do you know when to kind of stick with something versus when to quit? I mean, it's a great question, and not everybody knows. I do know. I do remember that Seth Godin wrote a book years ago about this called The Dip, where he said, there's 2 things. There's the dip, which is the necessary trough, the necessary kind of like, oh, this is kind of a hassle, but I've got to power through it. Things eventually get hard. And then there's the cul-de-sac, which is you just kind of keep going around and around and you don't make any progress, right? So the difference between the dip and the cul-de-sac, when to quit, when to not quit. So don't quit when you're in a dip, quit when you're in a cul-de-sac is the message of the book. It's hard to know when you're in there, though. I do think that if you're going around and around and around and not making significant progress, and you're less than halfway through the project, that's a pretty good sign that it's time to shelve it. Maybe not quit it forever, but set it aside and do something else. If, however, you are 51% of the way through the book and now you want to do something new, you want to start something new, it feels kind of like a pain to finish, that's normal. That's very, very normal. And my recommendation is try to persevere, because that happens to me every single book. About halfway through, I get bored and I want to start something new. And if I do this, I never finish anything. And that's okay if that's what I want to do, but I actually want to finish things. So if you're kind of going around and around and around, repeating the same things over and over again and not making significant progress, and you're less than halfway through the project, quit it. I mean, there's obviously some intuitive stuff going on. You've got to listen to that for sure. But if there's like a rule, that would be the rule. And if you're more than halfway through, you're still excited about this, but you're starting to feel some of the doldrums, that's totally normal. And I would encourage you to keep forging ahead.
Perfect. All right. So I know that we are coming down to the end of our hour. I'm just going to try to get one more in. This is from Jay Burt. And they asked, so to learn the rules first, before you break them or come up with something new, how many books in your genre should you read? Or just make sure you are picking the authority in the category that you're just trying to stand out in?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I would do is I would find like 1 or 2 books on Amazon, I think is the easiest place to do this. Find 1 or 2 books that your book is like, you know. So maybe it's like, I wanna write a book, a disruptive book about corporate America, or about the world of work. So it's going to be a disruptive business book. Well, you know, on your list, you would want a book like Rework. This is from the guys who started Basecamp. And this is a great book to look at. I mean, this book has sold really well, and their message is different in that, you know, they basically pick a fight with everything that is sort of commonplace in the modern business world. And on the back, they have some of these rules that they've broken. So ASAP is poison. As soon as possible is poison. Underdo the competition. Meetings are toxic. Pick a fight. Planning is guessing. Inspiration is perishable, right? So all the things that we would think are one way, they're the complete opposite. And then the format of the book itself is kind of fun. It's written almost as there are no chapters. There's just kind of like, there's no chapter numbers. There's just kind of a series of themes, and then like little blog posts, and then they've got cool illustrations. So that's a book to look at. So I would get this book, and then I would look how many like customers who bought this also bought this, and I would get 3 or 4 other books like this one, and not just read them. In fact, you don't even have to read all of them, but get a feel for them, thumb through them. How are they structured? How are they written? Read a few pages. I mean, ideally, yeah, read some of these books, but you want to pick 3 to 5 books that are category leaders in the space that you want to disrupt, and then go, okay, here are the rules, and then here's how I'm going to break some of these rules. So with Rework, it's like, well, we're still talking about the same things. We're talking about productivity and meetings and money and, you know, all the standard things that you talk about in the business book, but we're picking a fight with a handful of conventions, namely how the book is structured, and then how it's actually written, you know, writing style and message. So I would like literally go to Amazon and find 3 to 5 books that have sold well, 100+ reviews, buy them or get them from your library, and just put them on your table and kind of thumb through them and go, what are all of these books saying? What are they doing that they all have in common? That's a pretty good sign that these things are working. And then I'll pick like 1 or 2 of those things and not do them. In fact, do the exact opposite of those things.
Beautiful. All right. So I know that we are kind of over time now, but I just wanted to end with this last question from John that I think will be really helpful. And I apologize to anyone who did not get their questions answered on air, but Jeff has very kindly offered his email address. So I encourage all of you to visit his inbox when you can. So John says, I'd like to learn more about working with you. How can I start the conversation?
Yeah, thanks, John. I appreciate that. And I think somebody asked me, do I coach people? So basically what I do is I teach courses for writers to help them succeed. And then I teach, coach, and write. So I teach writers through online courses, online programs, and then I work with individuals and small groups in a coaching capacity. And then I run a ghostwriting agency where we work with you to plan your book, coach you through the process of writing your book, and can even write the book for you depending on what your need and budget is. So happy to chat with those of you interested in that. The best way to get more information on this, just to email me, jeff@goinswriter.com. I did put that in the chat. Looks like I can broadcast that to everybody. So I did that. I don't know what that does. And yeah, if you have any other questions that didn't get answered, somebody asked me about writing software. I tend to use Scrivener. Yeah, glad you liked it. If you have any questions, if you're stuck on a book idea, if you just want to get unstuck, just shoot me an email. Following kind of those formulas that we laid out. It's like this, but different like that. Everybody thinks X, but what's actually true is Y. And then deciding whether it's going to be format or modular. Shoot me your book idea. Happy to give you feedback on it. No strings attached. So thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, Lulu. And thanks everybody for hanging around. I really enjoyed chatting with you. Hopefully this was helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. The replay will be sent out. So if you missed any of this information or looking for links or Jeff's email, you can grab it there. Jeff, thank you so much. This has been like the height of edutainment. It was educational and entertaining. A lot of new perspectives on things that I think are giving people things to think about. So thanks to everybody who stuck around and stayed with us. And I hope you have a wonderful day, a great week. Jeff Goins, thanks again so much. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.